Hello, my name is Bob Bowie. I'm a professor at Canterbury Christ Church University, and this is a short course, a video, first introduction to Liberation Theology, that I'm making for teachers and students of A-level religious studies. Some of you will know a book that I've written which has some material on Liberation Theology, chapter 3.6, Liberation Theology and Marx. And so I will draw a little bit from that book, but I'm also going to draw from some primary sources as well. So there are a number of important liberation theologians, not least Leonardo Boff, who wrote this book, Jesus Christ Liberator, and then there is the Liberation of Theology by Segundo, and also perhaps very famously Gustavo Gutierrez, Theology of Liberation, and I'll get on to talk about some of the thinking of Gutierrez in the next session. But it's not just a Catholic movement. Liberation theology is connected to the thinking of Jürgen Moltmann on human dignity, and also more recently, liberation theology has influenced a number of thinkers, including it's connected to there's a black theological movement. This book, Jesus is Dread, by Robert Beckford on black theology and black culture in Britain, has a connection to liberation theology, but also these books by Ainsbury and Newlands on human rights. These are Protestant thinkers writing about human rights and also drawing on ideas from liberation theology. So we can see that liberation theology relates to quite a lot of theological movement beyond Latin America and beyond Catholic thought, but it's also a key influencer in education, particularly because of that book, Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is writing at the same sort of time as Gustavo Gutierrez, and there are strong connections between each. Some would say, in fact, that Paulo Freire was in a sense a liberation theologian. So I'm going to write a few notes on this page here. So whilst you're listening, you might find some of the drawings and the diagrams on here useful. And I'm going to refer back to my own studies of liberation theology that I did at Lancaster University, where I was taught by Professor Patrick Sherry, who has also written an excellent introduction to liberation theology, which you can still find secondhand if you search for Patrick Sherry's work on Amazon or one of the other online bookshops. So if we're going to sort of try and fix liberation theology in time and place, we probably need to think of a bit of a timeline here. I'm going to put the Council of Trent there, and then I'm going to put Vatican II there. Council of Trent is in the 16th century. Vatican II is in the 1960s. And then we have liberation theology emerging out of the Vatican II movement. And the reason for mentioning the Council of Trent really is just that the Council of Trent happens in the 16th century. It's before Vatican II. It's the time when the Church tries to pull together a council. The Church in the early centuries had councils whenever the Church was trying to make decisions about creed, or decisions about key theological ideas, decisions about what ought to be in the Bible, what the canon should be. And then after the Reformation, or during the Reformation, the Catholic Church reasserts itself and its identity by having a Council of Trent, where they've got some strong ideas about ensuring that there is a kind of uniformity and a stability of doctrine, so the doctrine itself is fixed and clear. The beliefs are not going to be changed by these Protestants and the stuff they're up to. That they're still going to be united and uniform, so there's going to be a common approach to things like worship and other things will reflect this. So in contrast to the diversity that's breaking out within the Protestant movements, as there is a kind of that impact of the Reformation. And so you've got this kind of background of the idea of a church council being about establishing what's firm, establishing that is connected to the past, to the tradition of the past, so making the claim that it's apostolic, this is the truth that's been handed down, and also ensuring that there is a uniformity in the way things are done. And the reason for saying that is because at Vatican II, some of those elements change. So Vatican II is called by Pope John the 23rd initially, and it leads to some changes. Now, whilst the changes are not necessarily in terms of substantial changes of theological understanding, although there's a lot of debate about that, certainly the application of theology, but also the expression of how to be church does change. So it now becomes possible for there to be an expression of the Catholic faith that is local to Latin America rather than Europe, for example. And that is where Liberation Theology comes in, because there are gatherings of Latin American bishops who are then talking about, well, how do we apply Vatican II to Latin America? What does it mean? What does it mean to the part of the world that is Latin America? And Latin America is quite important because Latin America is not like Europe. Now, a lot of theology is formed in Europe, and Europe is in the 1960s is progressing and developing. It's kind of come out of the catastrophe of World War II. It's rebuilt itself, and there are these great aspirations for Europe and the West. John F. Kennedy is talking about the development of the world and the fact that technology is going to bring about this amazing transformation. And that might be true for the West and for Europe, but it's certainly not true in Latin America. Latin America is a poor part of the world. 20 countries, very diverse. Some of these countries are heavily dominated by indigenous populations, others by the settlers from the Spanish and the Portuguese expansions of previous centuries. There is political unrest. You have, on the one hand, you have movements that are encouraged by Cuba and by the Soviet communist ideas, and on the other hand, you have governments that are kept in place supported by America and the West, because they are, what we've got is a kind of the Cold War. You've got the fighting of the conflict between American capitalism and Soviet communism taking place in other parts of the world under, by proxy, if you like, war by proxy. And in there you've then got this question of, well, Europe is wealthy, and the theological voices of Europe seem to come with wealth, but what about the theological voices of the poor Latin Americans? And so there's a sort of a really interesting shift in the way theology starts to happen. Theology in Europe has traditionally been a bit like this. You kind of sort out what your theory is, what your key ideas are, and then you apply them. So it's kind of theology into praxis. This is where the praxis is over here. This is your doxy, your orthodoxy, and this is your orthopraxis. Okay, you get the right ideas first, and then you can get the right actions afterwards. Okay, these shouldn't be capitals, this P and this D. Okay, well that's theology. That's how theology in Europe works. Well, what about Latin America? Latin America takes a different approach. It comes the other way. It starts with the praxis. It starts with the experience. And from that, it forms the ideas, the doxy. Because you start in poverty, you see things differently. So you've got a different kind of movement going on. Let me give you a really straightforward example of this, because it's quite tricky perhaps to see what's going on here and why this might be important. You take something like the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan, there's a guy who's been mugged, who's been beaten up, he's on the side of the road, he's in a desperate situation, maybe dying of his injuries, ignored by the wealthy, established, religious types who walk on by, don't want to get involved, picked up by the Samaritan who is a bit of a bit of a perhaps Samaritans are viewed with significant suspicion and not viewed as being good people. The Samaritan picks up the person beaten by the side of the road, takes them to a place of safety, to an inn, hands over a lot of money to the innkeeper to look after this person until they've got better. Now you read that if you're wealthy and you see this is a story. It's directed at you because you're in danger of being one of these wealthy religious types who walks on by, and what you should do is do your bit for the poor, cross the road, help the person in the ditch who's been beaten up. But that's a kind of reading from a position of power. You have the power to walk across the road. You have the money to pay the innkeeper. You can look after the poor bedraggled folk over there. So the poor are over there. You, the good Christian, are the Samaritan over here. Okay, so it's put the poor outside of the church. Actually, the poor outside the church. You are the church, and you've got the money. You just make sure you give it to the right source. Well, this is very kind of wealth-centered idea. What happens if you don't have money? If you don't have money, you can't put the person up in the inn. So one of the things that was going on in the 1960s is there were different readings of that parable taking place in Latin American communities, where they were saying, well, hang on, we don't really see it like that. We feel like we've been beaten up by the side of the road. We're living in poverty. We're starving. We're living in vast shanty towns. We don't feel like we've we're not in this position of being accused of not doing our bit. We are in the ditch. And the person who crosses the road is Jesus. Jesus saves us. Jesus comes over to liberate us from our situation. So the way you see and respond to the Good Samaritan is transformed by your starting point, your experience. If you live in wealth, you see it as a moral tale to tell you what you should do with your wealth, and not sit on it, and not sit on your religious sort of class, if you like. If you are poor, you see it as a story that tells you that someone will come to save you. It's a completely different kind of reading. Latin America starts. Now this is starts from that experience, from praxis, from orthopraxy. And that's important because one of the writers that we're going to go on to, Gutierrez, draws on people who try to make sense of their experience, so social scientists. Okay, I'm just going to add one more thing to my introduction video, and that is really to raise a question about this diagram here, about the contrast between the kind of European approach to theology that begins with doxy and goes to praxis, that starts with right ideas and then deduces right actions and right ways of being, versus a Latin American model, which starts, the Liberation Theology model, which starts with experience and praxis, right praxis, and then deduces right doxy, right ideas as a consequence of that. Now, there's an interesting question that you can ask about this. If there's right experience and right praxis, does that mean some people's experiences is wrong? So maybe the Europeans have the wrong experience, and therefore the theology they develop from their wrong experience is impaired by that experience. So perhaps the experience of the poor is the right experience. So you've got a question about how do you decide whose experience is the right experience when you're developing theology, particularly if you want an idea of theology that's going to be shared, that's going to be held by many people. Of course, the other problem is, about the problem of right ideas. If you're saying you're starting with ideas, can you really just start with ideas free-floating? Doesn't anybody who writes theology write in some sort of context, in some sort of setting? So the other side of that problem, the problem coin, is if you've got a set of theological ideas that you say are kind of free-floating, they're universal, they stand for all time. Well, are you really saying that they didn't happen in certain contexts? Because the whole story of theology is a story of something that happened in history, in time, and in place. It's like a long conversation that's gone on, and that conversation has been shaped by events. I made reference to the Council of Trent and the Reformation. That was an event, a historical and political event taking place that led to the shaping of ideas. And I made reference to the early church councils that happened in the early centuries of the Christian church, which were trying to deal with all sorts of challenges of making sense of what it was to be Christian. And we can look at the Bible as a collection of many different sacred texts from different times, from different communities, different people living in different sorts of experiences. So you've got a bit of a kind of chicken and an egg problem. If you start with praxis and right praxis, then whose is the right praxis? How do you decide whose experience is the right experience? If you start with the doxy, with the right ideas, the ideas that you say are right, or how can you be sure? Or are they just not dependent on your perspective in your situation? So I'll leave you with that question.